You know, my interest in the paranormal began with my love for cryptids. There was a backwards point in time where there was no interwebs and therefore no YouTube, Netflix, or insert your personal streaming site, where one could just type in a search bar and entertain their predilections for unknown species, alien visitors, or dead people that just won't go away. It was in that time, in those forgotten days of yore, in my informative years, when I had to get my paranormal fix from the idiot box, or my father's parental insistence on me and my older brother watching the movie adaptation of Whitley Strieber's Communion, because he felt we had to know the truth at the tender ages of 6 and 8. All childhood trauma aside, I felt compelled to watch each and every documentary I could find on cable, and in those days we pretty much only stuck to two, the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot. With the passage of years, the advent of the internet and streaming services, as well as the consumption of numerous books on the topic of cryptids, I have to say that I'm not all that enthused with Bigfoot. I mean, as far as cryptids go, I guess the likelihood of the species' existence is the best there is, considering habitat and the greater number of sightings in comparison to his aquatic Scottish counterpart. However, I think what irks me about Bigfoot is that for as close as shows like Finding Bigfoot would have you believe that we are to proving its existence, I can't help but feel that this proof is actually a long way off. Why would my paranoia have me believe this? Well, I guess it's because it was fed by this book, The Inhumanoids, by Barton M. Nunnally, and I don't mind telling you that it's one of the scariest books I've ever read. Like, slap it in the freezer and sleep with the lights on kind of read, a holy cow, House of Darkness, House of Light kind of read with better editing, lack of literary cliches used ad nauseum, and minus the out-of-place religion is dumb commentary that had absolutely nothing to do with the haunted happenings. But anyway, the book The Inhumanoids has a lot to say about not just Bigfoot, but other encounters with human-like entities with a seemingly inhuman agenda. Whereas those of us who enjoy a good documentary on cryptids would readily believe that Bigfoot is simply a large, ape-like, human-like, scientifically undiscovered species that just goes about its day doing perfectly sensible, ape-like, human-like stuff such as crapping in the woods, or antiquing in the woods, or crapping on antiques in the woods. The Inhumanoids has a more sinister light to shed. Let's just say that something stinks in the seemingly innocent land of Bigfoot. And it isn't just residing in the skunk ape's discarded trousers. Let's begin at the beginning, because it's a very good place to start. The legend of a Bigfoot-like creature is international and way older than the date of the Patterson footage. Native peoples around the world have stories of Bigfoots, and our own Native Americans are no different. Joe Flying By, a late tribe elder and medicine man in the Hunkpapa Lakota tribe on the Standing Rock reservations, has been quoted in different sources regarding the Chie-Tonka, stating that the Chie-Tonka is a being from ancient times who can shape-shift into any animal he needs to. He is both spirit and real being, but he can also glide through the forest like a moose with big antlers, as if the trees weren't there. And interestingly, gliding is exactly how John Clark described the way a 9-foot, blonde, Bigfoot-like creature he saw moving around his campsite in Sequoia National Park in California late one night in the summer of 1975. It made no sound. I assumed it was gliding because I didn't see any up and down movement like with walking. After dawn, he and his friend Ralph Johnson unlocked themselves from the trailer they had hid inside of and looked for footprints, but found absolutely none. All I know is that what I saw up there was not human. It was nothing I have ever seen before. On July 16, 1918, the Seattle Times ran a story about two miners whose cabin in St. Lawrence, Washington was attacked by hair-covered creatures who stood 7 to 8 feet tall and who could also make themselves invisible. At a similar area and time, Fred Beck and another group of miners began to see tall, man-like hairy creatures that walked upright as they prospected for gold near Mount St. Helens and the Lewis River. One of their encounters entailed finding huge, human-like footprints sunk 4 inches into the sand, mysteriously located in the middle of a sandbar that was 160 feet from the edge of the creek. There were no other footprints nearby. Just these two, as though the thing that made them had dropped from the sky and then left in the same manner that it came. The encounters of Beck and his men would get weirder and eventually come to a head one fateful night. The miners had decided that they would leave the area, mostly due to the frequent sightings of tall, hairy man-things that their collective brains could not reconcile. The fact that earlier one of the miners, called Hank, had tried to shoot one with seemingly no physical effects to the beast did much to help the group concisely conclude that this shit was bullshit, and that it was high time to tail it out of there. They decided to wait until the morning so they could travel by daylight. Their slumber was interrupted at midnight when a group of Bigfoot had apparently also decided that this shit was bullshit and attacked the cabin. They began by throwing rocks at it, which escalated into a bunch of them jumping on top of the roof, repeatedly battering it as if to collapse it upon the miners. One creature attempted to break down the door, while another reached through some open chinking in the cabin and grabbed an axe. Hank fired upon the creature that attempted to grab the axe, causing it to pull away as the other men barricaded the door or fired upon the creatures trying to bring the roof down. Beck reports that there were moments of respite from the attack, but the ordeal didn't end until daylight. As you can imagine, the men hightailed it out of there with only their guns, leaving behind $200 worth of equipment that they never reclaimed. Beck related this incident to a ranger at Spirit Lake, who evidently related the story to reporters, who swarmed all over the abandoned cabin, finding giant, human-like footprints all around it, which gave enough credence to the story for the area to forever be named Ape Canyon. And while it's easy to see that this story would seem to show that Bigfoots are purely flesh and blood, there are some interesting points. For one, Fred Beck, who would later admit to having many psychic experiences from childhood on, had this to say regarding his feelings about the creatures. They were not of this world. I was, for one, always conscious that we were dealing with supernatural beings, and I know that the other members of the party felt the same. He would also say that he felt that the Bigfoots were from another dimension and somehow comprised of both physical and psychical material, existing as a link between human and animal consciousness and being able to control the degree of their materialization in the physical world. Beck has also stated that through what he felt and experienced, that he believed that the creatures could not be killed, captured, nor would anyone ever find the dead body of one. Another point that Bart Nunley, the author, points out is that while these creatures were numerous and huge, they couldn't bring down the door to a rickety shack as though they lacked the materialization to do it. But he also acknowledges that it's possible that while they may have had the physical strength to do it, perhaps they just chose not to. And while I read this part of Nunley's book, the part about materializing or invisible Bigfoots giving witnesses the feeling that they were dealing with supernatural entities, reminded me of another phenomenon that people have claimed to have had in the woods that could be completely related, or not at all. I'm referring to the phenomenon known as the silence, or la silence if you're French, but it's not strictly a French phenomenon, so who gives a shit. If you're familiar with David Paulides and his Missing 411 book series, where he discusses the overwhelming number of unsolved missing persons cases from national parks around the world that have disturbing and unexplainable patterns, you might already be aware of the silence. Like the name suggests, it is a phenomenon where absolute silence suddenly occurs in areas where it's nigh impossible to achieve, like in this instance, a forest, which is chock full of at least ambient noise at virtually all times. Birds chirping, wind rustling in the treetops, water flowing from a nearby creek, etc. The silence is often accompanied by a sense of foreboding or being watched by the person experiencing it. As if that isn't eerie enough, some have claimed to see something quite bizarre emerge from the forest at this time. Do you remember the movie Predator? You know how the predator looks when he's in camouflage mode? Yeah. Some witnesses have said that they see that waltzing through the eerie, absolutely silent forest, and some testimonies of this camouflage Sasquatch sighting came forth before the movie Predator came out. After the thing passes, everything returns to normal. Now, assuming that this camouflage thing really exists, we can't say for certain that it is a Sasquatch. But as I was researching this phenomenon, many people attribute this to Sasquatch. Now, whether or not a Bigfoot can make himself invisible to traipse through the woods for crapping and antiquing and antique crapping purposes, there are also stories proposing that they may be transporting themselves through invisible portals into our reality. Getting back to the Inhumanoids, Barton Nunnally relates a few stories from someone he knew personally, who, along with Nunnally, had a few experiences of this nature around the property that the author once called home in western Kentucky. This man, Roy, tells about a time in 2004 when he was walking beside an old fence line next to a field. He suddenly saw what he described as an area a few yards wide that looked like heat waves rising from a hot summer road, while everything around the area looked completely normal. He then said that he saw a squatchy-looking creature come out of the wavy area as if it was some kind of a doorway. The creature saw him and telepathically communicated, "Leave me alone," before it retreated back into the wavy doorway, which disappeared then after. Roy would then keep an eye on that area from time to time and told Nunnally that he saw the wavy doorway appear with creatures emerging from it on a total of 3 different occasions. Roy and the Nunnally family, as well as many others, had several encounters with Sasquatch-looking things in this part of Kentucky. And if you're up on your cryptids, you may recall this one as the Spotsville Monster. But since we're focusing on the weirder side of Squatchness encounters, we're moving on to stranger things than invisible Bigfoots. Several years ago, I worked with a woman who claimed that her house was haunted and that she had at one time been abducted by aliens. In my naivete and desire to not be rude, I mentally scoffed because, after all, the chances of having a haunted house or being abducted by aliens is minuscule in this part of the Midwest. And here she was claiming that both things had happened to her. Pfaff! You get one if you get any. You don't get both. Apparently, this is actually common. Areas where UFO sightings abound are often the same areas where people see cryptids and or have their homes haunted. The 3 types of phenomena seem to be linked somehow. Now when I think back on my ex-coworker, I go, yeah, it's not unusual. In regards to Sasquatch, not only are the phenomena linked, they can be downright blended together. And when I say blended together, I mean you don't know which is really happening. Is it more UFO alien encounter, or is it more cryptid encounter? Or is it more of a fashion advertisement aimed at the world's primates? I see that weirded out look on your face. Well, let me tell you a story. July 1974, near Palmdale, California, a torpedo-shaped UFO was sighted hovering close to the ground. Witnesses reported several masses fall from the craft. The witnesses would report that they couldn't determine any definite shapes to these masses. They only knew that they were large, seemed to have glowing red eyes, and that they were animate, as after they fell to the ground, they ambled off in all different directions. Upon searching the area, investigators found several humanoid tracks, which were measured to be 18 inches long with a 6-foot stride. Anyway, a few months later, 40 miles away in Saugus, California, 2 teenage boys reported to police that they saw a Bigfoot-like monster carry off a pig. When Fortean investigator Adele Childress interviewed the boys further, they revealed another weird observation that they had made. The monster had been wearing a glowing blue belt. A few weeks later, Childress got a phone call from witnesses who reported seeing a UFO at a location called Texas Canyon, which was just north of the location that the teenage boys had told her they saw the glowing blue-belted Bigfoot. Then, a couple weeks after that, Childress received another call from a group of teenagers who also had a strange encounter in Texas Canyon. Only instead of seeing a UFO, it was a group of tall, hairy humanoid monsters that were like Bigfoots, but were described as having dog-like faces instead of ape-like. However, the teenagers reported that as they sped down the road in the canyon, the creatures screamed and made monkey-like chatter as they threw stones at the car. Childress and her husband drove down the Texas Road Canyon that the teenagers took. That night, they did not find any footprints, but they did see another UFO. This one was a strange blinking light that suddenly disappeared, but they could hear the rush of the wind as it flew overhead. Childress also said that she and her husband noticed that as the blinking light appeared, 2 aircraft, a plane, and a helicopter seemed to suddenly have engine trouble. The next day, Childress called the local airport to see if any of the pilots reported seeing anything strange the night before, but she was shuffled from desk to desk and didn't get any straight answers. Here's where things start to get really strange. So Childress decides to run some errands and winds up at the local supermarket. Two guys in a white Plymouth pull alongside her as she parked and started staring at her. They never left the car, and they never stopped staring at her. Trying to shrug the weirdness off, she carried on with her shopping. As she's in the supermarket, she notices the husband of one of her friends speaking to a man she does not recognize, but as they're talking, they keep looking at her. Finally, they both approach her. Ed asks if they can speak with her. She says yes, so they head back out into the parking lot. Here, Ed then tells Childress that back in 1967, he had been attached to a military intelligence unit in Southern California that was investigating UFOs. He went on to say that in '67, he was called to investigate a UFO crash site in a remote desert location. As his special unit approached the scene, they noticed that a strong, pungent odor was stinking up the place. When they investigated the busted-down craft, they realized that the thing had landed before it exploded, but lying in the debris were 4 hideous-looking creatures. According to Childress, Ed described them as huge, about 9 feet tall, covered with fine hair, and were a perfect likeness for what has been described as Bigfoot. Each of the dead Bigfoots were wearing a copper-colored belt with a huge buckle fitted with small buttons. The belts glowed when activated, although Childress never found out what activated meant. The Bigfoots were also wearing sandal-like boots with very thick soles, but aside from the boots and belts, they weren't wearing anything else. Like, no pants. Belts, obviously. Pants, no, since space squatches have figured out how to traverse parallel dimensions, but not that the purpose of belts are to hold up your damn pants. I don't care that they can glow, they can still hold up your damn pants. Strangely, as if things weren't strange enough, Ed told Adele that the glowing blue belt that the McBride boys saw on the other Bigfoot worried him. Maybe because some blues clash with brown, I don't know. Then Ed says, "Adele, these beings are dangerous. They've been turning up in recent years in growing numbers. Stay away from them. You're in over your head. There are other animals too which are vicious. We don't want you to get in trouble over this. I wouldn't tell you what I know if I didn't think you were in danger. I've been in this business a long time and I know what I'm talking about." He went on to say that the government bagged the creatures' bodies, the bits of broken space crap, and shipped everything off somewhere. Childress says that the man that was with Ed never said a word, and the guys in the white Plymouth did drive off eventually, but she wasn't sure when. In April of 1975, Adele Childress's home was broken into on 3 different occasions. However, nothing was taken, and nothing was destroyed. The only indication that someone had broken into her home was that all of the doors and windows were unlocked and wide open. For several successive nights after the break-ins, the Childress family was subjected to horrible pounding noises on the roof and sides of the house. Then, one morning in June, Adele's children and several others were waiting for the school bus when they all spotted a hairy, white-faced ape that was staring at them. Like a pervert. It was at this point that Adele Childress decided to take Ed's advice and not dig any deeper into the blue-belted Bigfoot thing. Let them wear fashion accessories that only held up their non-existent pants when they were activated, right? Who was she to judge? If Bigfoot's wearing glowing belts coming out of UFOs isn't weird enough for you, how about witness reports regarding robotic Bigfoots? D. Douglas Graham wrote about a robotic Bigfoot encounter in a 1995 November issue of Fate magazine. The encounter happened in 1966 to 2 boys who were traveling on horseback in an isolated area near Peterbottom, Arkansas. Prior to the encounter, the boys ran into a farmer on a tractor who was hightailing it out of the valley. The farmer warned the boys not to go any further because there had been a monster living in the bottoms for the last few days, and he had just seen it. Although the farmer was obviously disturbed by this encounter, the boys decided to investigate. After going further into the wilderness, the horses refused to go on, so the boys continued on foot. They eventually came to a meadow where they saw what looked like large clumps of white fur like a dead animal lying by a tree. As they stared at it, the clumps of fur stood up and revealed itself to be a 9-foot snow-white Sasquatch that stank like hell. As the creature began to walk toward them, it started to make a sound like a radio signal, beeping successively in a timed interval. As you can imagine, the boys ran out of there like the dickens. They reported what they saw, which resulted in a posse to hunt down the beeping Bigfoot, but it was never found. They did find a lot of cattle mutilations in the vicinity. Sound familiar? Maybe even a little synonymous with UFO-type activity? In July of 1956, in Boise, Idaho, a man's fishing excursion was interrupted by a stink. Then out from the brush, he saw the 8-foot-tall stink squatch emerge. The man reported that it had reddish fur and was female, so you know where he was looking. Like a pervert. Anyway, he said that as the thing walked, it made a metallic-sounding laugh. As I've said before in my Ouija board video, I'm not saying that I believe all these stories. However, according to investigator Tony Healy, who has put in 20 years of research into the Australian Bigfoot known as the Yowie, if you exclude the invisible, robotic, alien, or just plain weird Bigfoot sightings, you exclude about 20% of them. Now, 20% isn't even half of reported Bigfoot sightings, but it's definitely an antihistamine percentage, meaning it's not to be sneezed at. And I'm willing to bet that this percentage could actually be larger, as most people who have these kinds of Bigfoot sightings are less likely to report them altogether. Think about it. If you refuse to report a Bigfoot sighting for fear of damaging your reputation and the consequences therein, then how much less likely are you going to report an alien, robotic, or immaterial Bigfoot sighting? I've only included a small number of these bizarre reports recorded in Barton Nunnally's book. If you're interested in the rest and more, I encourage you to read it for yourself. He even includes what he believes is behind all the inhumanoid encounters, which is the most chilling part of the book, and something I plan to cover at another time. But for now, I'm tired, and I don't care. Just read the book.